Prospera is the world's only free city in the world, in modern history even. So it's basically a special economic zone, as you said, but with very high level of legal freedom, such that with a few exceptions, especially around criminal law, but with those exceptions aside, we can have our own regulations, our own legal framework, our own courts, and also our own police. And so that enables us to basically be able to to basically take a step backwards and basically ask ourselves the question, how would the ideal governance structure look like? How would the ideal laws look like, from the perspective of people and businesses, and then work backwards from there and figure out how we should structure everything.
What are some other economic zones and how does Prospera differ from them? I think like Hong Kong and other are brought up in these discussions.
Yeah, I think in the world there are around 5.5 thousand different special economic zones. So but almost all of them are just simple zero tax zones or import or like zero tariff zones for importations, for instance. So they are not really having any innovation in terms of the in terms of the governance framework as a whole. So what makes Prospera unique is that it's a full stack legal autonomy. So again, it's not just a small tax thing. We can make our own regulation in a much deeper way. I guess as you say, like you could think of Prospera versus Honduras in the same way you can think about Hong Kong versus China. So Hong Kong is obviously part of China; it's not a country of its own, but it has its own regulatory system, its own police court, all of that. And so I guess Prospera is similar in that sense.
Okay. And so high level picture, like if I move there, like how will I experience life differently from living in the US or somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, so the most glaring thing is that it's much smaller currently. We have a few dozen buildings and a few hundred people here, growing super fast. When I was here, we were I think less than 200, and now we are about 300 people. So we're growing really rapidly, but from a low baseline. So that's the biggest difference, right? But the more kind of subtle differences, especially if you're doing business in traditionally regulated industries like biotech, crypto, fintech in general, construction, energy, is that you have a very different regulatory system to work with. So in the EU and in the US, when you work in these traditional regulated industries, you're used to dealing with the FDA or the Fed or the SEC or the NRC or the FTC, and all these agencies that basically have monopoly power and say you can do this, you say yeah or nay to anything, and oftentimes they're doing it in very unpredictable ways. I know many crypto founders who were afraid of continuing to work just because at any point the SEC could just knock at their door and say they did something illegal. Um, and so we don't have that. The entire paradigm doesn't exist in Prospera around these type of agencies. What we have instead is that we have basically one simple regulation for these types of situations. And that regulation is that we require these types of businesses to have insurance. So they have insurance coverage. And so essentially, instead of having a monopoly regulator, like the SEC or the Fed, we have a market of insurance providers. And each insurance provider then looks into each company, let's say you're developing a new drug or whatever, and they determine, is this a safe thing? If it's not safe, they will not give it a insurance policy, obviously, because if someone sues them, if they screw up, then they have to pay up, right? So insurance company doesn't want to be on the hook for losing money. So they become the kind of experts. And so this decentralizes the system a lot. And to kind of give a concrete example of the outcome of that is in Prospera, it's on average 1,000 times cheaper to go to market in biotech versus the US. So in the US today, it can cost on average $300 million to only in the FDA licensing fees alone.
Mm.
So let's say you're a startup and you raise a $3 million seed round. That's 1% of everything you will have to pay to the FDA alone. Don't count not counting the science costs.
Development. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that leads to this massive invisible graveyard of potential drugs that could have been developed, but that aren't currently. And so that's very different to Prospera, where you can do it for an order of $300,000. This is 3 orders of magnitude difference in costs and maybe 30x difference in time.
Right. Okay. And where does that cost difference come from? Because like still, if you want it to be, I assume you. So is the safety is the safety requirement still as high in Prospera as in the US, but it's more efficient, or what is the pitch there?
Yeah. So the cost delta comes from basically insurance companies. Two things. One is that they are better at navigating risk typically than big regulators, and so they do a better risk benefit trade off. That's the main thing, and then also that there's a competition that drives down the cost over time. You can't take as much surplus. Um, you can have as much margin, and so currently insurance companies definitely want to see phase one safety trials, right? So in FDA you have this, the phase one safety trial, and then the phase two and phase three, which are efficacy and not safety. And so typically insurance companies still want to see a safety trial before they give you a policy, but they care less about efficacy. That's more up to the market to figure out, and also to independent kind of third party, um, let's say stamp providers or trademark providers that can give you a trademark of saying that, okay, this is not only safe, this is efficient as well. But it doesn't have to be like, you don't have to prove it before you go to market.